My name is Brian Heafy, and I'm the head of School of Social Sciences here at the University of Manchester. And it's a great pleasure to introduce our speaker and our colleague tonight, or this evening, Gary Younge, who's going to speak on the theme of the US election. Most of you will know that Gary Younge is an award-winning author, broadcaster, and is now a professor of sociology at the University of Manchester. Most of you will know him as a columnist of The Guardian. He was appointed The Guardian's US correspondent in 2003, writing first from New York and then Chicago. In 2015, he returned to London, where he became The Guardian's editor-at-large, and he's written 5 books, including his last book, which, for those of you who haven't read it, I suggest that you do, which is called Another Day in the Death of America, A Chronicle of 10 Short Lives. And Gary has presented previously on that work to us here in the school, which was enlightening and a very, very well attended and appreciated lecture. As well as The Guardian, Gary's written for the New York Review of Books, Granta, the Financial Times, the New Statements, and has made, as most of you will know, several radio and television documentaries ranging on subjects from gay marriage to Brexit. In recent years, Gary has won a lot of awards as Feature Writer of the Year for the Society of Editors Press Awards, Feature of the Year for Amnesty Media Awards, the James Arison Career Achievement Award from Hunter College, City University of New York, and I could keep going on. From 2001, 201 to 2003, he won Best Newspaper Journalist in Britain's Ethnic Minority Media Awards 3 years in a row. Gary has also won many awards and been nominated for many awards for his book, Another Day in the Death of America. I won't go through all of those. There are very, very many American awards and British awards for which he was nominated or won awards for that book. And for us, the key moment was in 2020 when he left The Guardian to take up his professorship here in sociology in the sociology department at the University of Manchester, which has been probably one of our most exciting appointments. It certainly excited a lot of media interest and a lot of student interest, a lot of interest from across the university when he was appointed and took up that position this year in April. He's also a visiting professor at London South Bank University, and I've noted that he is alumnus of South Bank University, somewhere that I worked. So that's really good to have South Bank featured in his progression as a journalist and an academic. And in 2020, he was also made an honorary fellow of the British Academy, which is really one of the highest academic accolades you can get in the UK. 4 years earlier, he was made a fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences. He's got many and has been awarded many honorary doctorates from Warwick University, Mount Holyoke University in Massachusetts, the University of Arts in London, Heriot Watt University, London South Bank University. He's an honorary fellow at Cardiff University, and he was a the Bell Zeller Visiting Professor at Brooklyn College, CUNY, from 2009 to 2011. So that's just a brief introduction, background to Gary. I'm not going to say much more now, other than I'll pass you over to Gary, and after that, we'll have a question and answer session, which will be chaired by one of our colleagues here who works on America as well, on American culture. That is Professor Angeli Wilson. So let me pass over to Gary, who's going to talk about the US election.
Hello and welcome. My name is Gary Younge, newly appointed Sociology Professor at the University of Manchester, and before then Editor-at-Large and a columnist at The Guardian, where I was US correspondent for 12 years. And it's in that capacity that, and before that, I covered every American election from 1996 until 2016. This year I didn't go because of COVID. So I'm sharing my observations from afar. Thank you so much for watching. On November the 2nd, 1920, in the small town of Ocoee, Florida, an African-American landowner, Mose Norman, went to cast his ballot in the US presidential election only to be rebuffed. In the preceding weeks, African-Americans had been registering to vote in record numbers across the South, even as, in the preceding years, the Ku Klux Klan had been enjoying a revival. Norman, along with another African-American, Jules Perry, had spearheaded the voter registration drive among African-Americans in Ocoee that year. But when Norman went to claim his franchise at the polling station that day, he was turned away. He returned with a gun, and after a fracas, he was turned away again. His audacity and the sight of so many black residents trying to vote enraged sections of the white community, who formed a mob and began to march through the town in search of Norman. As the rest of the black voters gave up trying to vote, the mob descended on the home of Jules Perry, who was harbouring Norman. When they tried to break in, Perry shot at them and killed 2. Norman managed to escape, but when the mob came back with reinforcements, they caught Perry, who was trying to flee, and lynched him, hanging him from a telephone post by the highway. Over that night and the next day, another 30 or so black residents of Ocoee were killed, and their churches, schools, and other buildings ransacked and burned. A century and a day later, following an intensive registration and get out the vote campaign, African Americans flocked to the polls in record numbers in early November this year. Notwithstanding fewer polling stations, longer lines, onerous requests for ID, and a few accounts of armed Trump supporters patrolling places where people vote, the day itself passed with relatively little incident. The predictable and predicted mayhem of holding an election in the middle of a pandemic in a nation where each state sets its own electoral regulations and the president is an incendiary narcissist then ensued. By the next day, it became clear, the day after the election, that the presidency would be decided in the cities of Milwaukee, Philadelphia, Detroit, Atlanta, Phoenix, and Las Vegas. In the conservative imagination, cities still occupy the same place they did in the early 20th century, venues of vice, depravity, and corruption. But since the Great Migration of African Americans from the rural South to the urban North, and the migration of Latinx communities into America, that anxiety has been racialized. White people are a minority in all of those cities. African Americans are a majority in Atlanta and Detroit and outnumber whites in Milwaukee and Philadelphia. At a Republican event I attended in Kenosha 2 years ago, and Kenosha is the county where Jacob Blake was shot not so long ago, Milwaukee was a lifeline. So this time, as the votes came in, crowds of Trump supporters, some armed, gathered at counting centres in many of those cities, demanding that the counting be stopped or continued. Protesting illegal votes without ever defining what constituted illegality, they took their complaints to the courts and mostly failed. In Philadelphia, police received a tip-off that an armed group was arriving with the intention of disrupting the count. 2 men have been charged with weapons violations. Shortly after he won in 2016, Donald Trump thanked African Americans for not voting. The African American community was great to us, he told a crowd in Grand Rapids, Michigan. They came through big league. Big league. And frankly, if they had any doubt, they didn't vote. And that was almost as good because a lot of people didn't show up because they felt good about me. This time, he was not so smug. He pointed to 2 of the cities that would decide his presidency in disbelief that their residents and municipalities could play such a decisive role in such a big election. Detroit and Philadelphia are known as 2 of the most corrupt political places anywhere in our country. Easily, he said. They cannot be responsible for engineering the outcome of a presidential race. Back in Ocoee, Florida, which sits in Orange County, which is now a place where white people are in a minority, life goes on. Carl Devine, the great-grandchild of 2 survivors of the massacre, John and Roxy Williams, believes that there are still lessons to be learned from what happened to his forebears 100 years ago. I'm seeing this election as they saw theirs, he told National Geographic shortly before the vote. After 100 years, some things haven't changed. When one group is trying to suppress another group from voting, the whole Constitution is in jeopardy. When one person is denied, all of us are denied. The polarization exemplified over the last few years has been described by some as a portent of America's second Civil War. 2 antagonistic ideological camps are driven by different information, gleaned from different news sources, and have built different worldviews about everything from climate change to coronavirus. Now, this view is not new. In The Big Sort, Bill Bishop illustrates how Americans have been increasingly congregating in ideological lagers since the 70s, moving to areas where they can find more like-minded people. In 1976, the point, he says, at which Americans were most ideologically mixed, roughly a quarter of Americans lived in counties that voted in a landslide for a presidential candidate. By 1992, that was up to over a third. By 2004, it was almost a half. It was in that year, while covering the presidential election, that I recall watching the third debate with about 40 students in Iowa City. The Republicans sat on one side and the Democrats sat on the other, and at moments the Republicans would break into cheers or laughter at a phrase or facial expression of one of the 2 candidates, to the bewilderment of the Democrats. And then a few minutes later the Democrats would do the same, leaving the Republicans similarly confused. They were not just watching the candidates on a split screen. They were viewing the entire event as though from a split screen. Each side hermetically sealed from the other, as though they were witnessing 2 completely different events in a parallel universe. In his 2012 victory speech, Barack Obama stated, "We are not as divided as our politics suggest." That appears to be wishful thinking. Indeed, not only are Americans more likely to see the world differently, they are also less likely to see the people with whom they disagree from day to day. Bishop, in The Big Sort, wrote, "We have built a country where everyone can choose the neighbours and church and news shows most compatible with his or her lifestyle and beliefs, and we are living with the consequences of this segregation by way of life. Pockets of like-minded citizens that have become so ideologically inbred that we don't know, can't understand, and can barely conceive of those people who live just a few miles away." This year's election exemplified that. In 2016, Donald Trump won 23 of Wisconsin's 72 counties that had previously voted for Barack Obama. Joe Biden won back just 2. In Georgia, 9 of the state's 159 counties switched party allegiance in 2016. This year it was just 1. Almost half of those Georgia counties were won with 70% of the vote this time. In 2012, it was less than a third. But viewed through the lens of this summer's Black Lives Matter protests and the changing demographics of America, this moment is better understood, I believe, as the thrashing death throes of the first Civil War than the birth of a second. For while the American Civil War between the North and the Confederate South between 1861 and 65 ended with a military victory for the North, politically it resulted in a draw. It abolished slavery, but it never delivered equality. America was a slave state for more than 200 years and an apartheid state for the best part of a century. Throughout that time, in certain parts of the country, all black votes, by definition, were illegal, and conservatives worked hard to keep it that way. America has only been a non-racial democracy for 55 years, and that short reign hangs in the balance. Now, as white people are set to become a minority within a generation, the tectonic plates on which the nation's political culture has perched for the last 150 years are shifting, creating volatility, anxiety, instability, and opportunity. That doesn't mean that we can explain Trump's rise or fall purely through America's racial history. The world in general, and this moment in particular, is too complex for that. But it does mean that we cannot begin to understand it without taking that history into account. For these racial contradictions were clear from the outset. Just days after Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses Grant, signaling the military end of the Civil War, the abolitionist Frederick Douglass argued, "Slavery has been called many names, and it will call itself by yet another name, and you and I and all of us had better wait and see what new form this old monster will assume, in what new skin this old snake will come forth next." They would soon find out. For little more than a decade following the Civil War, in what is called the Reconstruction era, civil rights were enforced and the suffrage of freed slaves enabled and protected. Between 1870 and 1876, Mississippi had 2 black senators. South Carolina elected 6 black congressmen. Louisiana briefly had a black governor. That period also saw the rise of the Klan, which sought to terrorize black communities and was suppressed by the US Army, not to be seen again until the period around the Ocoee Massacre. Ultimately, Reconstruction was wound up as African Americans were sacrificed at the altar of national unity and bipartisanship. Federal troops were withdrawn from the South, and the individual states pursued their policies of segregation for another century. In 2007, I interviewed the black radical and activist Angela Davis, and she explained to me there was the negative abolition of slavery, the breaking of chains, but freedom is much more than just the abolition of slavery. What would it have meant to provide economic security to everyone who had been enslaved, to have brought about the participation in governance and politics and access to education? That didn't happen. We are still confronted by the failure of the affirmative side of abolition all these years later. I asked her, does that not leave black politics stuck in the 19th century? And she replied, the problem is that we, as a country, haven't moved on. Certainly it's important to recognise the victories that have been won. Racism is not exactly the same now as it was then, she continued, but there were issues that were never addressed and now present themselves in different manifestations today. You only move on if you resolve those issues. It took 100 years to get the right to vote. Both the battle lines and the nature of the battle itself have, of course, changed over the last 150 years. It's no longer a matter of North versus South. According to most surveys, most of the cities where black Americans most like to live are in the South. Atlanta, the DC area, Dallas, Charlotte, According to the census, the most segregated major cities are in the north: Milwaukee, Detroit, Buffalo, Chicago. And it's not just about black and white. The largest minority in the country is now Latinx. The fastest growing is Asian American. Given the fissile nature of this moment, political violence is always lurking and occasionally pounces. There were clashes this weekend between Trump supporters and their opponents in DC. But the nature of this battle isn't military, but political and to some extent legal. It's the unfinished business of securing the fruits of freedom, of full citizenship for all Americans. The attachment to the Confederate flag and the antagonism over the statues of Southern generals are just the most potent symbols of the roots of the conflict. But what remains is the basic architecture of a state that has systematically excluded people on grounds of race. In her new book, Caste, Isabel Wilkerson compares America to an old house built on shaky foundations, in desperate need of repair. Like other old houses, she writes, America is an unseen skeleton, a caste system that is as central to its operation as are the studs and joists that we cannot see in the physical buildings we call home. Caste is the infrastructure of our divisions. It is the architecture of human hierarchy, the subconscious code of instruction for maintaining a 400-year-old social order. We are the heirs of whatever is right or wrong with it. We did not erect the uneven pillars, but they are ours to deal with. What is new is that the dominant race is set to become a minority by 2045. Less than half of all American children under the age of 15 are white. In 5 states, California, Texas, Hawaii, New Mexico, and Nevada, white people are already the minority. Maryland is set to tip any day now. Arizona, Florida, Georgia, and New Jersey will be there by the end of the decade. Excuse me. To the extent that this election and the last 4 years have revolved around identity politics, the primary identity concerned has been whiteness, its anxieties, rage, capacity for empathy and solidarity. It could be that Barack Obama tipped them over the edge. As president, this black son of an African immigrant and a white mother embodied the very future that they feared. In his new book, A Promised Land, Obama considers Donald Trump's victory a racialized response to his presidency. Trump, Obama writes, promised an elixir for the racial anxiety of millions of Americans spooked by a black man in the White House. It was as if my very presence in the White House had triggered a deep-seated panic, a sense that the natural order had been disrupted, which is exactly what Donald Trump understood when he started peddling assertions that I had not been born in the US and was thus an illegitimate president. But even before Obama, the Republicans had been heading that way anyway. In the early 80s, veteran pollster Stanley Greenberg was conducting a focus group in the Detroit suburb of Macon, talking to former Democrats who had switched to Republican Ronald Reagan. After he read them a statement by Robert Kennedy about racial inequality, one participant said, "Well, no wonder they killed him." That stopped me and led to a whole new analysis of Reagan Democrats, wrote Greenberg in a 2013 report. I realized that in trying to reach this group of people, race is everything. 30 years later, Greenberg observed, the fixation had remained intact even as it had evolved. They are acutely racially conscious, he told me, referring to a focus group he conducted a year after Obama's re-election. They are very aware that they are white in a country that is becoming increasingly minority. Much has been made of exit polls signalling a shift towards Trump among racial minorities and away from him among whites. Polling did not come out of this election well, but there is no reason to doubt that Trump may have received some bump among minority voters. He made an aggressive pitch for them and was starting from such a low base that the only way to go was up. But for all these shifts in voting patterns in this election, the broader trajectory is clear and undeniable. Black and Latino voters overwhelmingly favoured the Democrats, and without their huge margins in key states, Biden could not have won. In the Rust Belt states, where the minority population has remained stable, Democrats are increasingly dependent on the cities and suburbs. Without Milwaukee, Biden would have lost Wisconsin. Without Detroit, he would have lost Michigan. Without Philadelphia, he would have lost Pennsylvania. Elsewhere in the South and West, migration is helping make previously competitive states safe for Democrats and states that were once safe for Republicans competitive. Through the 70s and 80s, Colorado, New Mexico, Nevada and Arizona were all safe Republican states. The first two are now reliably Democratic. The latter two are swing states that Biden appears to have won. According to the census, in the last 20 years, Latino populations in those states have increased by between 17 and 48%. That's not a coincidence. Now, there's nothing inevitable about any of this. Demography is not destiny. White people have long been a minority in Texas, and yet, despite considerable Democratic efforts, Republicans have held that state easily since 1976, for most of the time with double-digit leads. Florida is also very diverse, and yet continues to prove mostly elusive for Democrats. Meanwhile, the whitest states in the nation, Vermont and Maine, are reliably Democratic. And conservatives saw this trend coming long ago, with Republican grandees arguing that they needed to realign their platform and rhetoric away from the coded racism of Nixon's Southern strategy, which aimed to unite white people in the South and in the suburban North with coded racial messaging, but instead to take account of this new reality and become more of a right-wing, multiracial party. After all, there is nothing about the politics of diversity in itself that cannot be accommodated within a neoliberal agenda. George W. Bush had the most racially diverse cabinet in history at the time, as does Boris Johnson in Britain now. Relying electorally overwhelmingly on the white vote, even as that proportion of the electorate shrank, was rightly considered a liability. Back in 2012, Republican consultant Ana Navarro told the Los Angeles Times, "Where Mitt Romney's numbers are with Latinos right now, we should be pressing the panic button." South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham at the time said, "The demographics race we're losing badly. We're not generating enough angry white guys to stay in business for the long term." This wasn't an issue of morality, but math. They were actively alienating the part of the electorate that was growing in order to attract more votes from the part that was shrinking. Something had to give. One Republican strategist told the National Journal in 2012, "This is the last time anyone will try to do this." But it wasn't. Trump defied that orthodoxy, doubling down on white supremacy, racist rhetoric and voter suppression. His 2016 victory, and his impressive showing this time, indicates that Republicans can stay in business with bigotry, at least for the medium term. But its days are numbered, and in order to remain viable, it must become ever more shrill, crude, discriminatory and exclusionary. His appeal is better understood not as a departure from America's racial politics, but as an intensification of it. Bitter white wine, with an H, in a new orange bottle. It is not yet clear whether the Republicans have or can kick that addiction. In 1981, the late Lee Atwater, one-time chair of the Republican National Committee and member of the Reagan administration, explained the appeal and the manner in which the Southern strategy was executed. He said, "You start out in 1954, which was the year that segregation was outlawed, by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. But by 68, you can't say nigger anymore because that hurts you, it backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing and states' rights. You're getting so abstract now that you're talking about cutting taxes. And all these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and a byproduct of them is that blacks get hurt worse than whites." Obviously, sitting around saying, we want to cut this, is much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than nigger, nigger, nigger. What Trump showed was that a significant section of white America was not as squeamish as Atwater had thought. You could just say it. And even if some of them didn't like it, they'd vote for you anyway. Electorally, Trumpism may prove fragile as the racial composition of the electorate continues to change, but having matched Mitt Romney's vote share and far exceeded John McCain's, what this election has made clear is that even when witnessed in all its deranged, bigoted, incompetent anime, it remains electorally competitive and politically viable. It may not have the numbers to govern nationally, but it has the reach to disrupt and obstruct governance. The Democrats may have defeated him, but they cannot ignore what he represents. So the fact that this is a losing electoral strategy, or soon will be, should not be confused with the fact that it can maintain significant appeal. In September 2016, the Claremont Review of Books published an essay by Trump's former National Security Advisor, Michael Anton, entitled The Flight 93 Election. The essay's title was a reference to the passenger plane that crashed in a field in Pennsylvania on September 11, 2001, after the passengers and crew tried to overcome the Al-Qaeda terrorists who hijacked the aircraft. Anton wrote, 2016 is the Flight 93 election. Charge the cockpit or you die. You may die anyway. You or the leader of your party may make it into the cockpit and not know how to fly or land the plane. There are no guarantees except one. If you don't try, death is certain. It appears that the entire Republican Party has joined Trump on this kamikaze mission. True, Trump lost his election, but Marjorie Taylor Greene won hers in Georgia's 14th district and soon be a congresswoman. Taylor Greene has said, among other things, that George Soros, a Holocaust survivor, collaborated with the Nazis. She's linked the Democratic Party with child sex, Satanism and the occult, claimed the white supremacist rally held in 2017 in Charlottesville was an inside job to further the agenda of the elites, and claimed that there was an Islamic invasion into the US government. In 2016, the former Republican presidential hopeful Mitt Romney tweeted, "If Trump had said 4 years ago the things he says today about the KKK, Muslims, Mexicans and the disabled, I would not have accepted his endorsement." Almost 2 years later, Romney decided to run for the Utah Senate seat, and Trump endorsed him. "Thank you, Mr. President, for the support," Romney responded. In November 2017, South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham lamented to CNN, "What concerns me about the American press is this endless attempt to label the guy, Trump, as some kind of kook, not fit to be president." Graham apparently forgot that he'd told Fox the year before, "I think he's a kook. I think he's crazy. I think he's unfit for office." When, on election night, the president insisted he had won and that the election was being stolen from him and he wouldn't concede, Politico contacted senior Republicans for a comment. Not a single one would get back to them. The party that once evoked America as the shining city on the hill was now turning out the lights. On the 100th anniversary year of the Emancipation Declaration, which formally freed the slaves, Martin Luther King made his famous speech. The part that's most remembered is "I Have a Dream," but there is another section that received a big cheer that day. King told the March on Washington on August 28, 1963, "In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." King continued, "It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note. Instead of honoring that sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check. A check which has come back marked insufficient funds. A few years ago, I spoke to the late Jack O'Dell, who worked with King for many years, about that speech. And he told me, well, so long as it's only known as a dream speech, then it's reduced to nothing more than a vision. But the section about the bad check makes it an indictment of the country that isn't just about a dream anymore. So they just stopped talking about that poem. In the years that followed the March on Washington, there would be huge demonstrations that would prompt transformative legislation, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited discrimination in public places, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which outlawed discrimination at the polling booths. The Voting Rights Act determined, among other things, that anything affecting voting rights in much of the South would require pre-approval from higher courts. Until then, all black votes were potentially illegal for the simple reason that they were cast by black people, who could be turned away from the polls because they couldn't guess how many jelly beans in a jar or how many bubbles in a bar of soap. A few months before the Voting Rights Act was passed, a 25-year-old activist and organiser, John Lewis, led protesters up St. Edmund Peters Bridge in Selma, Alabama, to demand the right to vote. That evening, ABC News interrupted Judgment at Nuremberg, a historical drama about Nazi war crimes, to show scenes of Lewis and others being beaten bloody on the bridge. Lewis died in July. Trump was the only living president not to go to his funeral. But on the wall of his congressional office in Georgia hung a poster from that period showing a black hand with a pen set against the backdrop of cotton fields and the words, "Hands that pick cotton can pick our public officials. Register and vote." That was precisely what the segregationists were keen to prevent. 50 years after King's speech on Washington, just a few months shy, the guarantees put in place with the Voting Rights Act began to unravel. The Supreme Court ruled 5-4 to gut the act. Arguing before the court just a month after George Zimmerman had been acquitted for killing Trayvon Martin, Attorney Burt Rain opposed the Voting Rights Act, stating, there is an old disease, and that disease is cured. That problem is solved. Within hours of the ruling, both Texas and Mississippi announced their intention to introduce voter ID laws, which have the effect of excluding the poor, young, and minority voters. In Georgia, Brian Kemp, the man responsible for purging his voter rolls and putting more than 50,000 voter registrations, most of them from African Americans, on hold for discrepancies as minor as omitting a hyphen in their name, ran for governor. In a state that has seen a 24% increase in minorities over the last 20 years, they cut the polling places by 10%, most of them in minority areas. Kemp ultimately won by just 54,723 votes against Stacey Abrams, the African-American woman who would spearhead the drive to register tens of thousands of Georgia voters to win the state for the Democrats this year for the first time since 1992. It was Clayton County, in John Lewis's district, that put Joe Biden over the top. The fact that they had been taking an axe to what might be understood as the Second Reconstruction has not gone unchallenged. It was just a month after the Supreme Court overturned key provisions in the Voting Rights Act that the slogan Black Lives Matter was born. It's still going. The eruptions this summer brought the legacy of racial justice centre stage, locating the killing of George Floyd in a historical context in which black lives have long been dispensable. Part of the reason there are systemic equalities is that they transcend not only party, but time, Stacey Abrams told the New York Times while their demonstrations were going on. We have to be very intentional about saying this is not just about one moment or one murder, but the entire infrastructure of justice. These moments stretched into autumn, with unrest in Philadelphia just a week before Election Day. This not only had an impact on how people voted. If exit polls are to be believed, voters were marginally more likely to think that racial inequality was the most important issue than they were to think that coronavirus was the most important issue. But they also had an impact on whether they voted. A significant increase in Democratic voter registration followed the Black Lives Matter protests. These demonstrations were also remarkable for the large number of white people and Latinos who participated. Just as during the Civil War and Civil Rights era, it is not just black people who want to move beyond the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. Now, appeals for national unity in a moment of such polarization ring hollow unless they spell out on what basis and to what end one intends to unite. America has been down this road before, at the end of Reconstruction, and arguably it is still on it. Frederick Douglass, shortly before the end of Reconstruction, commented, "If war among the whites brought peace and liberty to the blacks, what will peace among the whites bring?" This is not the first time that America has found itself with a new president in the midst of racial upheaval, with a protest movement capturing the nation's imagination, even as others seek to turn the clock back. On the evening of John F. Kennedy's funeral, the new president, Lyndon Johnson, consulted with his key advisors over the content of his first speech to Congress. As he went around the room, they all pleaded with him not to stress civil rights, since there was little prospect of it succeeding. The presidency has only a certain amount of coinage to expend, and you oughtn't to expend it on this, said one. Johnson responded directly, "Well, what the hell is the presidency for then?" Joe Biden might well ask himself the same question. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary.
Thank you.
That's really impressive. Thank you. So now I'll introduce Angeli Wilson, who is Professor of Politics in the School of Social Sciences, who's going to chair this session. Thanks, Angie.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Gary, for such a, I would love to be able to say inspirational, but I suspect I want to say depressing talk. So thank you very much for that. Just a word to the audience very quickly, so that I can remind you how to send in your questions. So what I would like for you to do, if you have a question, use the Q&A function there and type the question in. If you would like to ask the question yourself, if you just put the word live in that, I will then come to you and unmute you, and then you can ask the question yourself. If you prefer for me to ask the question, then I'll do that, and you can just type it in directly, and we'll get going with the Q&A. Gary, thank you very much for that. One of the things that you mentioned that I just wanted to ask you to say a little bit more about before we get into some of the questions was about the recent changes in the Voting Rights Act in the Shelby County versus Holder Supreme Court case. Can you just say another little word about that before we move on?
Sure. So up until 65, each jurisdiction, each county actually, sometimes, but certainly each state could decide how it ran its elections. That's why we've seen in this election, you know, Pennsylvania do it one way, Nevada do it another way, and so on. And in the South, in the former Confederacy, where the urge to stop black people from voting was the strongest, as I said, they would do things like say, well, you can vote if you can tell me how many jelly beans are in this jar, or how many bubbles are in this bar of soap. What the Voting Rights Act did was say, any changes, black people have the right to vote, everybody has the right to vote who's a citizen, and fits the basic criteria. Any changes that you want to make to anything to do with voting, you will have to go to a higher court, federal court or the DC circuit court. What the gutting of the Voting Rights Act did is said, you know what, the 60s are done, that old kind of racism is done. We don't need to do that anymore. The South shouldn't be treated any differently to anywhere else. And so they no longer had to ask, because when they asked, then there would be an investigation. Well, who's this going to impact and how? And if it impacted black people worse, then that would be an issue. So they no longer had to ask. And so the gloves came off, and they found all sorts of ways. Voter ID laws, as I said, within an hour, Mississippi and Texas have produced those. Or in Atlanta, where they just cut the number of polling stations, particularly in minority areas. In Texas this year, where they had one drop box for Harris County. Harris County, which is home to Houston, I think. Harris County is like bigger than some European countries, and they had one drop box. That wouldn't have been possible or as easy to do with the Voting Rights Act. So that's what so you can see why they really wanted to get rid of it.
Right. So I want to turn to some questions from the audience now. Do you think that we will continue to see a more mobilized African-American electorate in the future presidential elections, or was that simply a reaction to Trump and the toxic presidential candidate and his policies this time?
I think what's been interesting over the last 4 elections now is that you've seen a range of ways in which African Americans might or might not come out. So Obama's first election, you saw them very energized. 2012, for the first time, they overtook, in turnout, they overtook white voters. Then, so you can see that's with a candidate that they supported. Then in 2016, the African American turnout dropped quite considerably. They just weren't feeling Clinton. They didn't see, they didn't see the point, or they didn't see enough of a point. They didn't come out in enough numbers, which is how she lost places like Michigan and Wisconsin, because they didn't come out in Detroit and Milwaukee. And then this year, you see a significant number, significant increase come out, and I think they came out against Trump. I don't think they came out so much for Biden. I think it was an anti-Trump vote. And I think if we look at the voter registration, which climbed during June, during the protests, and if you look at where the vote went up, there was unrest in Philadelphia until a week before the election. And you look at the numbers of people who said that racial inequality was an issue. Whatever Black Lives Matter did in terms of mobilizing the right, which is a different question, I think it mobilized a significant section of African Americans. And it's worth here just dealing with just very quickly with the exit polls showing an increase in Black and Latino support for Trump. Exit polls are notoriously inaccurate, and polling itself is not doing so well at the moment, which is always important to bear in mind. Trump was starting from a very low base, but even if it's all true and the polls are true, and kind of it really shouldn't obscure us to the fact that around 88 to 90% of African Americans voted for Biden. That is a solid block of people. It may have shifted a little bit towards Trump, but that's still a solid group of people without whom there is no way that, without those margins, Biden doesn't win Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan.
Exactly. Okay, so picking up on the kind of those marginal groups within the electorate, I'm going to turn now to a question that looks specifically at the Cuban vote in Florida, and the person is wondering if you want to say anything about that vote and about the way in which that community supports the Republican Party, and has apparently some overlaps with the Proud Boys movement. And if you want to say a little bit about that, and then maybe as well about those more, shall we say, violent or fringe areas, groups on the left, and the tensions between those marginalized groups.
So I'll be honest, I don't know an awful lot about the Cuban community in Florida, but it sounds like the questioner probably would know more than me. I do think that the and this is the official term, the Hispanic category. Um, all races and ethnicities are constructed to some degree. That one is a very recent construct and a very kind of and one that frays very easily. That the Latinx community, it involves black people and white people and brown people and people from Mexico and people who say, you know, we didn't cross the border crossed us, fifth generation Chicanos, Dominicanos. So it's a very kind of it's a poor category to talk about, and it makes much more sense to talk as the as the question did about kind of individual communities within it, and that Florida is quite particular in having a significant section of its Latinx community is Cuban or Venezuelan or Nicaraguan or El Salvadorian, places where people may have come because they are fleeing communism, or if they're not fleeing communism, their parents did, or in any case, there is a kind of culture which remains of kind of anti-communism, anti-socialism, and anything that sounds like that, anything that smacks of that, or anything that can be portrayed as that. Trump spent a lot of time down there mobilizing around that.
Okay.
When it comes to violence, there is some left violence. There is some. Every single report that I've seen suggests that the overwhelming amount of political violence is from the extreme right and the right-wing militia. They were the ones that had a plan to kidnap the Michigan governor. They were the ones that actually shot protesters in Wisconsin. So I don't think we can talk about equivalence here, because there is the left and there are a few people on the left who are violent, and there's the right and there is violence on the right. They're not the same thing, and then it's in nowhere near the same kind of magnitude.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I'm going to combine a couple of questions here. What do you think, what concrete changes can Biden introduce to move us toward a more meaningful equality? But I'm going to follow that up with a question that I've picked up here that I think is a fantastic question. If you had just been elected president of the United States, what would be your first kind of 3 things that you think need to happen?
I mean, bearing in mind that that would never happen, and for reasons that will now become apparent, Biden is coming in the middle of a pandemic, at the beginning of what may well be a depression, and so the 3 things that I would do. The first is I would have a Marshall Plan for the inner cities. That after the Second World War, America, seeing the prospect of communism as a real thing, that the first election in France after the war, the Communist Party was the biggest party, fearing that, they poured a huge amount of money into as an investment into Europe. They should do the same thing in their inner cities. That there are entire kind of areas of America that have been left to waste, and the people in it have been left to waste, and that is unacceptable. And that would be an investment well made, and it would be, it would partly be social capital, schools and hospitals and all that kind of stuff, and it would partly be kind of job creation programs and so on. But you can't just have a sizable section of your population just left, and it does. I would introduce a basic income that everybody could draw on. That a different way of understanding that would be a comprehensive unemployment insurance that doesn't just run out. That the pandemic has crushed the economy, and it's not plausible to say, well, we'll give you unemployment for a little while, but then you have to get back on your feet, because you get back on your feet, there are no jobs, and part of the problem has been this attempt to balance public health and the economy as though they are kind of work in separate spheres, and they don't. Which would come to the third thing, which would be universal healthcare. That if there's something, your medical situation is private, but health is public, and this would be the moment to make the case. If ever there was a moment, this would be the moment to make the case. Now you can see why I would never be elected to anything in America. Those would be the three things that I would do. Whatever he does, I kind of would say this, wouldn't I? But in this moment, I honestly believe this would have to be transformative. That tinkering around at this stage in America, given the pandemic, given the economic crisis, given the state of race relations, you can't tinker with that stuff. He's got 4 years. I doubt Joe Biden will stand again. So he might as well go for it. And we do have this president of LBJ who nobody thought would be the transformative president that he was. And he introduced the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, Medicaid and Medicare. He did all that in 4 years, and then he stood down.
Well, there you go. Thank you for that. Yes. Sorry, I've watched LBJ's politics for years, being from Texas, and so thank you for mentioning him. So I just want to turn back to Biden, though, and his response. And you've talked about his response in terms of the policies that he might enact as president. More specifically, there's a few people that are asking kind of what do you think his specific response will be to the Black Lives Matter movement, or to the kind of calls to defund the police?
Biden's record on racial issues is not good, in my opinion. That Anita Hill and his role in Anita Hill, his role in busing, his role in the criminal reform, and it should be noted, it was African Americans who saved his nomination in South Carolina. Clearly they see something in him, or rather maybe they thought that maybe he could win in a way that Bernie Sanders couldn't. And his response to Black Lives Matter has not been brilliant, in my view. That said, I also personally believe that defund the police is a terrible slogan, because people don't understand it, and they think that they mix it up with police abolition or underfund the police. And actually, defund the police, in my mind, means have a public health approach to crime, which is kind of, actually, if you talk to many policemen, they will say an awful lot in Britain. They'll say an awful lot of the stuff that we deal with is not police work. It's kids who've been excluded or off-rolled from schools, and people with mental health problems. And that defund the police means that there are things that the police should not be doing. They should not be caring for for people with mental health problems. They should not be dealing with the problem of kids being excluded from school. They shouldn't be dealing with problems that essentially emerge from poverty. And so we need to take some of the money that is used to kind of police those communities and actually build them in a way so the police can do the work of keeping us safe. And so I do think defund the police is not a great slogan, and because it is so prone to being misunderstood, and can be so willfully misunderstood. So when it comes to Biden and all of this, we have to wait and see now what he does when he's tested. His record suggests that he's not great, but this is
Okay. Okay.
It's not that I want to give him the benefit of the doubt. He's a president. He has enough benefits already. But let's wait and see.
Okay. There are a few asking about your comments or your thoughts, sorry, about the role of Kamala Harris as vice president, both in the kind of symbolic role, but also do you think that African Americans came out to vote because of her being on the ticket, number one? And number two, do you think, thinking about this kind of relationship with the police, that maybe that in the long run that Kamala Harris's pass as Attorney General in California will end up being a problematic for that relationship between the African American community and the police?
Well, once again, I think the record of both of them with regard to criminal justice isn't great and hasn't been tested at this level. So I see every reason to be cautious and no reason to despair at this point. And I think that her presence on the ticket certainly didn't hurt. I think that questions would have been asked, given the range of people who he might have picked. Questions would have been asked had it not been an African-American woman. I think it really says something that we're at the stage where he had to pick a woman. And I think that America is now falling way behind in terms of, not having had a woman president. I think it didn't hurt because it wasn't a conventional campaign. There wasn't a lot of stumping. There wasn't a lot of rallies. I don't know the degree to which it really helped, because with the exception of Sarah Palin, I've never really seen large numbers of people come out for a vice presidential candidate.
Okay, all right. We've got one question that's not necessarily about the American election, but is about your relationship, maybe your relationship to America, or if you could offer some reflections on having been a journalist in America and having been a journalist in the UK, and maybe some differences that you see in the politics of both, or in the culture of both, political culture.
I find Americans much easier to talk to. They're much more, Americans, I feel, are generally much more open. That might have something, I think that's generally true. And I think it doesn't help if you have a British accent. It doesn't hurt, rather, if you have a British accent. Right. I think that kind of makes you a bit of a curiosity. I find that American elections are, because there's so much money involved, that as a journalist they become made for TV events. And the challenge as a journalist is to break away from that. So, I think that, and I would argue most years at The Guardian, let's nobody go to the conventions, or let's just send a theatre critic, because they are made for TV. There's no reason for us to be here. And every year I would be listened to politely, and they would say yes, 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 and then every year they would, send about 12 people, and I would be one of them. And they're boring, really. They're boring. You might as well watch them on the telly. And so the challenge was to get away from that, which I used to do by going to small towns. I feel that that's less of a challenge in Britain, and I think that's partly because there's less money involved, and so there is less obvious. There is choreography, but there's less of it.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Okay, so we're coming toward the end of our time together, and I bet about half of the questions have been around the future. So I just want to pull some of the themes together from those questions and ask you a little bit about what you think might happen next. So on the one hand, what is the future of Trumpism, and what does that mean for the Republican Party? And on the other hand, we have kind of what's the future for the Democratic left and AOC and that side of the Democratic Party. I'm going to use one of the questions. So that's the kind of two things that I'd like for you to address. but I do want to use the wording of one of the questions here. You said something along the lines that this is not the start of the Second World Civil War, but rather the death throes of the First Civil War. How sure are you that these are the death throes? Do you see this as a long, drawn-out death rattle?
So I do actually see it as a long, drawn-out death rattle. I feel that that these demographic issues, the kind of people thought it was going to happen much quicker. That's one of the points I was making. That in 2012, they're saying this is the last time that we can do this, and actually, no. Actually, in 2020, a kind of bigotry that's really not been seen since kind of George Wallace, won 70 million votes and very nearly kind of took the day, having won in 2016. But as Republicans increasingly, the fact that they keep losing the popular vote and keep having to rely on the Electoral College, that tension can only last so long, really. And each year it gets worse and worse for them. Each cycle it gets worse and worse for them. Sadly, I think Trumpism, had there been a rout, I think that would have been dealt a fatal blow to this kind of electoral strategy. I think racial resentment, racism in America, it's been around a long time. It's not going anywhere soon. No one ever went broke betting on American racism. So it's going to be there in some form. I think that its lifespan within the electoral system, which is what Trumpism is the kind of fomentation of that as a electoral force. I think it's got some legs, but I think its legs are weary. And I think that one of the ways in which we see that is this kind of increasingly deranged, kind of skewed relationship with reality that becomes harder and harder. And the fact that the Democrats' predominance in the cities is bleeding into the suburbs, I think becomes it spells the kind of death, long drawn out death knell of that as an electoral force. But that doesn't stop it being a political force or an ideological force. That, that has a way to run. I think the left of the Democratic Party, that kind of hangs in the balance. They did not do badly in these elections. They can. AOC has come out swinging. The fact that the Democrats lost a lot of House seats means that they will be increasingly reliant on them. Mm-hmm. And they're the part of the Democratic Party that people are excited about. Excitement isn't all there is, but I don't think many people are excited about Joe Biden. They're relieved about getting rid of Trump. They may like him, but there's not excitement. And sooner or later, something's going to have to shift. And that bit of the Democratic Party is the only one that is offering an ideological vision, some sense of where they might go. The rest of the party saying, make do and muster, win the next one, win the next one, win the next one. Because these people are like, look, this is what this country could look like. This is what this party should look like. This is where we should go. That will have a significant amount of clout. And the fact that Bernie Sanders went from being obscure and a laugh line to actually being the man to stop really kind of tells you something. And the fact, and here I'll end, the fact that the squad is overwhelmingly, if not exclusively, women of color, tells you something about the future of what that left will look like, and makes me very hopeful personally.
Well, it's always good to end on a note of hope. So it remains for me to thank you for your time and your thoughtful reflections on what's happened over the pond. I want to thank the SOS External Relations team and Andrew York, who's been doing our tech side, because we're all very glad that wasn't left to either Gary or myself. I want to thank Brian for his introduction today, but most of all, I really want to thank the audience, because this is an odd format for all of us. And I have to say, you have put in some fantastic questions, and that's really been engaging, and thank you very much for that. Good news for the audience is that the session is being recorded, and I understand that it will be available on YouTube at some point. So watch out for that in the sauce announcements. So once again, Gary, this is where we would not only clap for you, but then take you for a glass of wine. So I'm sorry we can't do either, but thank you very much for your time, and thank you to the audience.
Thanks so much, Angie.